Good. Recording seems to be going. Microphone seems to be working. Which means we now get to have another fun-filled, packed parasha looking at the Mishkan.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yay! Look at all those happy faces.
Tell them how to build it, tell them how it was built.
Exactly. Tell them how to build it.
Right.
Tell them about being built. Tell them that it was built.
That's right.
And don't worry, when we get to Vayikra, then we get to actually use it. But we've gone through an awful lot of time talking about the donations, talking about the design, talking about the construction, talking about its inauguration. It's rough. And especially since Vayekel and Pikudei are separate this year, it means we've got 2 weeks that we've been discussing this back-to-back this time, rather than doing a double parsha that we could have just worked our way through it more quickly. So, what are we going to do for one more Torah study class on the Mishkan? Wait and see. Okay. I hope that what I've come up with will get those juices flowing on this topic, and that you will not feel it burdensome that we are discussing this one more time. You can vote with your feet by the end of the class. Page 564. How are we doing? Everybody was already open? Wow. What a proactive group.
I sat next to the right man.
Yeah.
Going to tell Harry you said that.
Yeah.
All right, volunteer. Paula, thank you.
These are the records of the tabernacle of the pact.
Notice the comma there, rather important. Because what would happen if you read that sentence without that comma? These are the records of the tabernacle. The
The emphasis, you might think.
emphasis, or just a redundant mistake?
But it is redundant in Torah. That's right.
And if you look in the Hebrew, it's even more blatantly redundant, right? Ela Pekudei HaMishkan Mishkan.
Well, how many Mishkans were there?
Exactly. Well, a Mishkan is a place of dwelling. It's a place of what we eventually call the indwelling. So there might have been, and this isn't the focus of today's lecture, but there are some archaeological type scholars, not necessarily from the tradition, who do argue that there was a Mishkan in the center of the camp, and that there was a Mishkan at the periphery of the camp, based upon.
This is the one they went to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This is the Mishkan they would daven at. This is the one they wouldn't go on that one if you paid them. Now the idea was that one of them was for the place where the sacrifices were done, the Holy of Holies, and was the center of the community, and the other was where Moses went when he was communing with God. There's no need to do that textually. The idea that the Mishkan is described both at the edge of the camp and the middle of the camp is handled midrashically elsewhere. But just so you never can be said that you were never told, there are some academic scholars that do like to discuss that particular possibility. We are going to come back to this redundancy, however, or alleged redundancy in the way this is written, later. But we need to get at least a few more verses before we can do that.
So these are the records of the tabernacle of the pact, which were drawn up at Moses' bidding, the work of the Levites under the direction of Itamar, son of Aharon, the priest. Now Bitzalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, had made all that the Lord had commanded Moses. At his side was Aholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, carver and designer and embroiderer in blue, purple, and crimson yarns and in fine linen.
Okay. We could have stopped there, right? Keep going.
All the gold that was used for the work, in all the work of the sanctuary, the elevation offering of gold, came to 29 talents and 730 shekels by the sanctuary weight.
Ka-ching.
The silver of those of the community who were recorded came to 100 talents and 1,775 shekels by the sanctuary weight. A half shekel a head, half a shekel by the sanctuary weight, for each one who was entered in the records, from the age of 20 years up, 603,550 men. The 100 talents of silver were for casting the sockets of the sanctuary, and the sockets for the curtain, 100 sockets to the 100 talents, a talent a socket. And the 1,775 shekels he made hooks for the posts, overlay for their tops, and bands around them.
Okay, ka-ching, ka-ching. So we got a bunch of gold, we got a bunch of silver, and we got it down to the,
Penny.
not quite the penny, but pretty close. Onward.
The copper from the elevation offering came to 70 talents and 2,400 shekels. Of it he made the sockets for the entrance of the tent of meeting, the copper altar and its copper grating, and all the utensils of the altar, the sockets of the enclosure round about, and the sockets of the gate of the enclosure, and all the pegs of the tabernacle, and all the pegs of the enclosure round about.
Okay.
Just real quick, do we have an idea of?
What do you mean real quick? How can you dare interrupt this riveting narrative?
I don't mean to take you off topic.
I mean, we're reading a tax return here, and you think there's something that's worthy of interrupting this?
Sorry.
Please.
How much does a talent weigh approximately?
A lot.
A lot, like
Yeah.
more than a kilogram?
It's debated. Exactly. The problem was is that the term shekel and talent were of different weights in different contexts. So we're not exactly sure how much poundage we're talking here. It was substantial. It's not an improbable number. It's not like saying 50 tons of gold, which would be impossible. But it is meant to be a significant quantity. That much we can tell from context. But the exact pounds, there's a wide spectrum of debate on
I
it.
wouldn't want to be overly precise.
Well, but somebody did figure out the English word because talent is not the Hebrew word. Hebrew word looks like a kikah.
Yes, exactly.
So the question should be, what's a kikah?
And that's a question that gets slid under the table by translating it into the English. A talent, yeah, which no one knows what that means in English anymore either. It's one of those great things. But isn't this a riveting account?
Yeah.
And isn't it just like reading an accounting record, going through the books? Accountancy can be fascinating, I'm sure, but we don't usually like to read it out loud. Why bother? Well,
It's very important.
must be very important, right? Must be very important. Okay, well, we're going to look back at our doubling up of the word at the beginning of Mishkan, and we're going to see what the Midrash has done with that. And from it, we are going to spin our way through history.
This one gives an estimate on the gold at 4,386.5 pounds.
4,386 pounds. It seems a little excessive from my experience, given that all of that gold was less than all of the silver, which was less than all of the bronze, which all had to be carried.
So if there's 600,000 people,
Mhm.
there were 4,000 pounds, so that would be how much per person?
Not everyone got to carry parts of the Mishkan. Only very special people, very special Levite clans got to carry these things.
Not to carry, but they made the donation.
They made the donation, yeah.
Okay.
But then once it gets cast into all these pieces, someone's got to put that on their shoulders.
Right.
That's why they were given ox carts.
That's why they had the carts. Very good. All right. So, before people start reading too far down the page and ruining the surprises, let's start with our first midrash.
By the way,
Yes.
I googled it up. A Roman talent weighed 71 pounds, a Greek talent was 56 pounds, and a Babylonian talent was 67 pounds. Okay?
There we go. That solves everything.
It solves everything.
Paula, go ahead and read our first midrash
I
here.
think there's a problem in the Hebrew, so I'm just gonna, it's not mis.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know why I did that. It's
That's okay.
not in the right font either. But you're absolutely right. That should be a shin, and it should be a shin in the second line as well.
Right. The Mishkan. Mishkan. The word Mishkan is written twice. This alludes to the temple, which was taken as mortgage, mashkon, by the two destructions for Israel's sins. When Israel fully repents, the third temple will be built.
Okay.
Oh, these are the two.
That's Rashi based on Shemot Rabbah, on the earlier Midrash. So what's Rashi picking up on here? What's the earlier Midrash picking up? Is the doubling of the word Mishkan. And it says, what is the doubling referring to?
The two temples.
The two temples, exactly. Mishkan, Mishkan, bing! Bayit Rishon, Bayit Sheni. The first temple, second temple, which were built to essentially replace the Mishkan. So you had one Mishkan that eventually became two sequential temples. Both of those were wiped out. Which means that we're now saying in this midrash that the temples were taken as a mortgage, as a collateral, almost as a revoking part of a debt that needs to be paid off before we get it back. And the debt, of course, was caused by our sins. And the way we pay it back is repent, by turning fully back to God as an entire people. And once that's done, then we get our collateral back. And that collateral will be the third temple. Who's making it?
Oh.
Who's making it? Right? God took the first two temples as collateral against our debt, and he will return not them, but will return a third temple. Who's making it? Who's?
The temple?
Yeah.
God.
God?
He's going to build it?
We
And how
built
are the
the first
stones?
two.
We built the first two.
Yeah.
The temple is going to come down out of the heavens. Are you implying then that heaven is a physical location above us?
That's right.
And that there's going to be a sliding door in the sky and the temple will descend?
With quarries.
It's one of the midrashim. Okay, so let's see if we can begin to understand this notion of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, and see what tradition has said about it.
When the rabbis got to Mount Scopus, they tore their garments.
This is after the destruction, of course.
When they reached the Temple Mount, they saw a fox emerge from the house of the Holy of Holies. They began to cry, but Rabbi Akiva brightened up.
All right, so make sure we understand the mood here, right? The rabbis are coming to Jerusalem. This is about 70 years after the destruction. And they come up on Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, and of course everything is just in ruins still, all these years later. And there's a fox coming out of the spot where the Holy of Holies used to be. And obviously, could it be more depressing? And yet Akiva seems to be happy by seeing this.
They said to him, "Why so cheerful?" He said to them, "Why so gloomy?" They said to him,
And if you think rabbis don't have a sense of humor,
this is the Jewish way to answer a question.
yes.
They said to him, "It has become a foxhole, so shouldn't we weep?" He said to them, "But since the prophecy has come to pass from Micah, that of Zechariah,
Mhm.
thus says the Lord of hosts, there shall yet old men and old women sit in the broad places of Jerusalem."
Right, so there's this, will also pass. I must have left that out when I was typing this. So there's it's a much longer section in Makot with proof texts that I, unfortunately for space, had to condense. But the notion is that there are linked prophecies of Uriah and Zechariah mentioned in the prophecy of Micah. Well, Uriah is mentioned in Micah, the linking is mentioned in Isaiah. And what Akiva is saying is if the prophecy that's mentioned in Micah, which is the foxes come out of the desolate place, has come to pass, then the linked prophecy in Zechariah, which is that the temple will be restored, Jerusalem will be rebuilt, must also come to pass. We're not going to get to the good stuff until the worst of worst happens. And now that we've seen the worst of worst has come to be, we can rely on the same spirit of prophecy which predicted this terrible thing to give us this wonderful thing. Keep going.
They said to him, "Akiva, you have given us comfort. Akiva, you have given us comfort."
Lovely doubling, by the way, just to point that out, to go with our doubling theme for today. So the notion that the temple will be rebuilt, that the temple will be restored, has had a very, very deep connection in Judaism for the last 2,000 years, since the second temple was wiped out. And even at the darkest times, even looking upon the very destruction itself, there was seen in that destruction the glimmer of hope. that the temple would be restored, Jerusalem would be rebuilt, we would be a people whole again.
Was that the same at the destruction of the first temple? That there was that same level of optimism?
Not so much. At least when the people first came back from Babylon, the opportunity to rebuild, the feeling that the rebuilding was possible, at least in the books of Ezra, is not as optimistic. It's much more of a down and dirty slog to get things moving again. And people seem very reluctant, given the nature of the time. Whereas what we see here is that the people have learned to carry their optimism with them despite the worst of the worst, which, as it turns out, is going to be very helpful for the next 2,000 years, because it's going to be a long time before we get to start even thinking about building the temple again. Okay, onward.
7 things were created before the world was made, and these are they: Torah, repentance, the Garden of Eden, Gehenna, the throne of glory, the house of the sanctuary, and the name of the Messiah.
And proof texts are brought for all of these, but I'm going to the one that we need.
The house of the sanctuary. A glorious high throne from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary.
From Jeremiah. So, according to this teaching in Pesachim, in the Talmud, the temple was built before the universe. Which, since the first temple and second temple have already been built, and since we're only expecting one more in the series, means the third temple must have been built by God. And is simply waiting to be placed, waiting to appear, as it were. Whether it be descending from heaven, or whether it be blinking into existence, or whatever way you want to visualize it. If we take this midrash at absolute face value, it would seem to be that the third temple is already built and waiting.
In the creation, it says that God planted the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Normally we think of planting a garden, putting seeds in the ground,
Mm-hmm.
but it could be taking the whole garden and
Planting the garden as a unit,
Yeah.
as opposed to seeding the garden.
Yes.
Very true. It is possible. Absolutely.
And isn't there also a midrash that says that Bilam's donkey was created?
Yes, this is in a series of midrashim. The one that you're referring to is most famously presented in Pirkei Avot, but there are a few in this particular section of Pesachim of lists by different sages of things that predate existence, and this is one of the lists. So that very much should point out that this is not necessarily universally held, but that there is at least an opinion, and we'll see a fairly strong opinion, that says the third temple already exists. It just doesn't exist here. Not here, Orlando, but here meaning the physical world.
Even though in the top paragraph it says the third temple will be built.
Correct.
But that's Rosh.
Well, so that's the question of
Which midrash?
which way do we go?
Yeah.
But notice that all of this is pouring out of this question of the Mishkan originally. That the notion was that the Mishkan was built for the purpose of allowing us to connect to God, even though we were leaving Mount Sinai, right? It became our own portable Sinai in a tent form, so that we could continue to have that relationship, that connection that we had there at Mount Sinai. Well, with the Mishkan turned into a temple, and then the temple is destroyed, there's obviously a feeling that there's something missing. And so the notion of it being rebuilt and being reestablished is very, very powerful in the Jewish psyche. Which brings us to the next two quotes.
Hashem builds Jerusalem. The first 2 holy temples were able to be destroyed because they were man-made. But the third holy temple will be made by Hashem and will last forever.
From the Zohar, not known for always being clear, but in this particular case, the implications are pretty clear, which is that the first 2 were built by us, the last one will be built by God. The first 2 could be overthrown by humans because they were built by humans. The last will be permanent and eternal because it's built to a different design specification. It's built by a different contractor.
Why does it have to be a temple? Why can't it be another Mishkan?
Why not just build another tent? Why revert to the temple form? Why not go back to the original form? because the temple is what we had when it was destroyed. Now, that leads us with a question. We have a vision in Ezekiel that outlines a blueprint for a temple, and it's clearly a temple, a place of stone. We have a description in Rambam based on that and other parts of the Talmud, which also outlines a temple. But you might think, after all of these chapters and chapters and chapters of Torah that talk about the Mishkan, that would be what we would want to go back to.
The tent came from God. That was God's plan. The temple came from Solomon.
The first temple, indeed, and the second temple was built as a scaled down version because it was the best they could do at the time, that then got expanded into the glorious temple that people love to buy models of and pictures of, which was actually designed and built by Herod the Great, not the most religious man on the face of the planet, to say the least. And so it is quite odd that we would idolize the temple when we've been given something different. But the temple also represented, the temple in Jerusalem, represented the height of Jewish greatness. That the temple was considered to be one of the marvels of the ancient world, that even non-Jews who looked upon the temple of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount courtyard and complex were overawed and impressed by what people saw there. So to imagine that the people would be hearkening back to that rather than to a Mishkan, and to imagine that the people who wrote the Midrash, that either they or their parents or grandparents had seen the temple of Herod, would prefer a tent.
But maybe that's what God had in mind in terms of don't worry about the edifice, worry about how you're living your life.
Hold on to that thought. Please, hold on to that thought. You're almost prophetic. Okay. And by prophetic, I mean it's impossible to understand what you're saying.
Whenever I get a mitzvah on, it bothers me.
Accept, O Lord our
It's
God.
a long trip back to the north, right? Be stuck in the car with.
Yes.
Accept, O Lord our God, your people Israel in their prayer. Restore the service to your house. Receive in love and favor both the fire offerings of Israel and their prayer. And may the service of your people Israel be ever acceptable to you. And let our eyes behold your return in mercy to Zion. Blessed are you, Hashem, who restores your divine presence to Zion.
All right.
It's either the 5th or the 17th blessing.
Depending upon the day of the week. If it's Shabbos, it's the 5th blessing. If it's a regular day of the week, it's the 17th blessing of the Amidah, which is recited 3 times a day on a weekday and 4 times a day on Shabbos. So whether you've said this or not, a lot, Jews say this prayer a lot. And we've said this prayer for a very, 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 very long time. The restoration of the temple is incredibly important within the thinking of the Jewish people. And I know we don't talk about it a lot, at least not in the conservative movement, but it is a central element to how we imagine a future rebuilt. And the notion of whether God's building it or whether we're building it is a very contentious question within that, and hopefully as we continue to unfold it, we will see that there is a lot here. A few more proof texts and then we'll get down to the nitty-gritty.
The Holy Temple will in the future be reestablished before the establishment of the Kingdom of David.
Okay, so from the Yerushalmi, one of the other Talmud collections, slightly earlier than the Babylonian that we usually quote from, who's building the temple? Well, who's the Kingdom of David going to be established by? Well, God ultimately, but it's not a kingdom without a king. Who is the king that, what? Mashiach. Mashiach, a descendant of David. Right? Mashiach is considered to be the descendant of David, therefore worthy to be king. And Mashiach will be king one day. But this particular text says that the temple will be established before the establishment of the Mashiach's reign as king. Which would seem to imply maybe we build it. Now,
or what we do in it has some kind of impact on the arrival of Mashiach.
Still, it has to be built first.
Right, that
Something in
the
it.
building of it may be sufficient by itself, or the building and use of it may be a necessary component before Mashiach comes. But the idea that it would pre-exist the Mashiach's arrival is a very powerful one, which would mean someone better get some chisels and better start working. Now, there was an attempt to build a third temple. In the Roman period, after the destruction of the second, there was a brief window when we had a decent emperor in Rome. They didn't come often, and this one didn't last long, who did give permission for the rebuilding of a Jewish temple. And the sages said okay. And the process was begun to start building a third temple. But then, of course, Rome being Rome, the permission was rescinded, emperors change, and not going to happen. And eventually you have a Greek, a Roman temple to Jupiter put on the building there, the site there. That gets replaced by a church, and that gets replaced by the mosque that is currently there. So we did have a moment when this wasn't hypothetical. And the sages at that time said, build. Go ahead and build. We're not waiting for it to come out of heaven. We're going to go ahead and start building. Yes?
What about the group in Israel today, the Temple Mount Faithful,
Yes.
who built the accoutrements?
They've made an awful lot of stuff. They've got a menorah that they think is kasher for being the menorah of the temple. They've got pens and clothing and choshen mishpat and all sorts of things that they believe are ready to go as soon as there's a physical temple waiting there. But of course, there's a problem with that. What's the problem with building the temple at the moment?
There are some people occupying that mount right now who might not be too thrilled with the
Yeah,
idea.
the site isn't empty. Yes, the site is not empty. There is what is it, about 1,200-year-old mosque or 1,000-year-old mosque sitting on that site that is more or less well known. So if it disappeared one day, people might notice, and they might be upset if that happened.
Asteroid away.
What's that?
We're one asteroid away.
We're one asteroid away. An asteroid.
Ooh, that's good.
We should point out, A, therefore that's a good example of why we should wait for God to do it. And B, an asteroid big enough to wipe it out would do considerable damage to the city of Jerusalem as well.
We would be blamed anyway,
Asteroid or not.
so we might as well
So-
just do it.
I was kind of hoping that Saddam Hussein would
One of his missiles would miss.
would just accidentally run into it.
Yeah, unfortunately, God does not have quite that sense of humor, and so that did not happen. But it does raise the question that if we're not waiting for the temple to descend, but if we are instead waiting to build, then with Jewish control of the land of Israel, should Israel be engaged in a building project? And controversy ensues, of course.
Can't even build houses.
What's that?
Can't even build houses.
You can't even build houses without controversy, absolutely. And even in the non-contested parts of it, or non-widely contested, so somebody contests all of it, but non-widely contested, there are issues of construction and rights and everything. You know, getting a house built in Israel, just generally, even if it's not in one of the areas that are contested, is not exactly an easy process. Trying to build here, not going to happen anytime soon without some major changes and things. So why are we bothering to talk about this? Right? If there's a practical possibility, but it's really almost nothing, and otherwise we're just waiting for God to bring it from a pre-existing, built before the universe model, why bother even discussing it? Why bother discussing all of the Mishkan? Top midrash on the back page.
God said, I have instituted for them the order of the offerings. When they read in those passages before me, I credit it to them as though they had offered those sacrifices before me, and I shall forgive them for all their sins.
All right, so this is one of the underlying theological beliefs of Judaism that allowed it to exist past the temple's destruction, which was that talking about the sacrifices is as good theologically and spiritually as doing the sacrifices. I'd like to posit that the same rule can also work when talking about the temple or the Mishkan. That we may not have the opportunity in our lifetimes, perhaps, to participate in the rebuilding or re-establishment of the temple, but that doesn't mean that we should avoid talking about it. Because in talking about it, we receive the same merit as our ancestors did in the wilderness of building the first Mishkan. That the study of this is not simply an academic exercise, that by studying it, by reading the Torah each year about this, we are joining in that process. We are a participant in the building of the Mishkan through this revolutionary statement that was made in general about how we can relate to things we can't do.
Rabbi, how does this mesh with Yom Kippur and forgiveness?
Mm-hmm. You mean if all I have to do to get forgiveness is read about the sacrifice I would have given to get forgiveness, then why do I need Yom Kippur? We need Yom Kippur for the same reason that our ancestors needed Yom Kippur even while the temple stood, which was that the forgiveness that was granted was a two-part condition. No one ever said, and this will lead us in very nicely into our next section here from Jeremiah, no one ever said, if you do the sacrifice, God is forced to forgive you regardless of your intentions. The idea was always in Judaism and explicitly stated throughout our tradition that the sacrifices were a physical representation of the repentance in the heart. That if you lacked repentance, all the sacrifices in the world did not get God to forgive you. If you did not do tshuva and yet you brought a cow, tough. So Yom Kippur...
So bringing the cow could be a mechanical thing?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I didn't realize that. I thought if you weren't spiritually into doing the sacrifice, it was not a sacrifice that would be accepted by God.
Well, yes, but it would still be a sacrifice that happened.
That happened.
Right? So, for example, if someone wants to give tzedakah because they want to help a person in need, that is considered very high as a spiritual motivation and for spiritual credit, so to speak. If someone gives tzedakah because they want to impress their girlfriend, it still counts as a mitzvah in that particular case because you still are helping someone in need, but you don't exactly get the same spiritual bonus points for that. You are graded down for doing it with such a lesser motivation. Something like this, where the motivation is the essence of what you're doing. If you're doing tshuva, the sacrifice counts as tshuva and brings forgiveness, and if you're not doing tshuva, if you're not repenting, then the sacrifice is just the killing of an animal, makes a huge difference. And we're going to see that explicitly in the text that your husband prophesied that we would read from Jeremiah.
Stand at the gate of the Lord's house and there proclaim this message. Hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord.
Notice the repetition.
If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the orphan, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever.
Read the next paragraph before we do a little commentary.
Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house which bears my name and say, we are safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house which bears my name become a den of thieves to you? Okay.
Jeremiah's got a point. Right? So he's speaking to his generation. And his generation is at the cusp of destruction. The northern kingdom was already wiped out by the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom has already been harassed by the Babylonian Empire a couple different times. And they are wondering whether they will fall to the Babylonian might. And there is a consistent voice within the community, within the southern kingdom of Judah, that says, well, of course we're not going to get wiped out by the Babylonians. The temple, the temple, the temple. God's not going to destroy his own house. As long as we've got the temple, we're safe. And Jeremiah is pointing out that they're using it like a safe house, quite literally, for thieves. It's like you think that as long as the temple stands, God will never let it fall, never let the country be destroyed. So that means you can just do whatever you feel like. Because we got the magic house and God can't touch us. Because if he can't hit us without knocking down his own house. So we can do whatever we like. We've got God's temple held hostage. Therefore we can do anything. And Jeremiah is saying, no. The temple is a blessing. And absolutely, by also taking care of the poor, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, by doing justly and avoiding all of these wonderful hobbies that have become so common, you can enjoy its blessings and live in peace in this land. Absolutely. But don't think that it's some magic talisman that's going to protect you from the Babylonian army if you have not also married it with righteousness, which is going to be explained even more clearly in the next paragraph.
Go ahead, add your burnt offerings to your other sacrifices and eat the meat yourselves. For I didn't speak to your fathers, nor commanded them on the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. But just...
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
What? Read that sentence again. The "for I didn't" sentence.
For I didn't speak to your fathers, nor commanded them on the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices.
So, we've been reading chapters about God commanding about a place for sacrifices to be offered. And we're going to be reading an entire book called Vayikra, Leviticus, about those sacrifices. How can Jeremiah say that God did not tell us when we left Egypt about sacrifices? How can he act like sacrifices were our idea? We'll come back to that, but I wanted to make sure you understood how shocking that sentence is. Because it seems to imply that God never asked for sacrifices. And in the midst of a whole set of chapters which seem to be implying that God would really like a nice place to have sacrifices be offered, that should be creating some cognitive dissonance. If you're not scratching your head, you're not paying attention. Keep going.
But just this is what I commanded them. Hearken to my voice, that I may be your God, and you may be my people, and that you shall go in the path that I commanded you, so that it shall be well with you. But they did not listen or pay attention. Instead, they followed the stubborn inclinations of their evil hearts. They went backward and not forward.
Okay. By the way, if you have not taken the time to read through the full books of the prophets, like Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel and all the others, please do. Just find a decent translation and do read the words of the prophets. Because, as I hope you saw from just the short selection that's taken out of chapter 7, it is amazing what they saw in their generations and how the lessons that they had for their generation continue to apply today. Because what is Jeremiah saying here? Give me your own interpretation, your own reflections, your own views. What's the point of this passage?
Well, I think ultimately what he's saying is you're not going to need sacrifices. You got to pray. You got to talk to God. You got to be, in your heart, understand that you have to, as you said, atone. Mm-hmm. But that just killing an animal ain't going to do it.
A sacrifice is just a sacrifice. That's just the slaughter of a beast. Is nothing without everything else that goes along with actually doing what God said, which involves more than cutting the throat of an animal. So, what does this mean about the rebuilding of the temple?
The temple is almost meaningless. It's what's more important is how we live our lives and how we honor the Torah.
The word almost is exactly the right one. The temple isn't meaningless, God forbid, but almost in and of itself, yes. That is to say, by itself, the temple is a building. just like by itself a sacrifice is the slaughter of an animal. It is only when it is coupled with everything else that God told us to do, all of the other commandments that God gave us, that the temple has importance and has the capacity to take that and make it even more sacred and wonderful. Take that away, and it's just an abattoir. It's just a slaughterhouse. And if you do that, well, then it might as well remain unbuilt. Which might also imply that until these conditions are met, until this is the way we're living our life, why in the world would God either build the temple for us or let us rebuild the temple, whichever way you want to look at the construction method? Because the precondition, the building permit, depends upon what we're doing more than the temple itself.
But you can't look at it the other way around. That says that if a third temple was here, Jews would live their lives in a more holy manner.
You can imagine that. But from the example of the first temple days, but from the example of the first temple days, which is what Jeremiah is talking about, his nation did not seem to live a more holy life despite having the temple. From the example of the second temple days, the people who lived during that time that were at each other's throats with factionalism cannot really be said to have been living very holy lives.
It's one of the issues that it's necessary but not sufficient. Just because you have a temple doesn't mean you're going to lead a holy life.
Oh, true.
But if the temple was there, they might make the argument that it would be easier for people than to lead holy lives.
I would modify that to the point where I could agree that it wouldn't be easier to live a holy life. It would be easier for people to feel the holiness in a more tangible way. That is an after effect of the righteousness that precedes it. So it's the cart before the horse sort of issue. The temple is meant to be the expression, the outpouring of the people's righteousness and goodness. It's not meant to be the inspiration for it. The Mishkan itself was meant to be built because the people were desperate to have that connection to God that they felt at Sinai. It was that correct feeling that made it be built. It was the correct feeling of David and then his son Solomon that made the first temple be built, of wanting to have something that was more beautiful, more established, and more physical to allow this outpouring of goodness. But it was never that which preceded righteousness. And unfortunately, it cannot guarantee righteousness having been built any more than the Mishkan could, because otherwise we wouldn't have had all the trouble when we first entered the land of Israel. And all of the stories of the judges would have been completely unnecessary. And that's why focusing too much on the temple, without recognizing what it's meant to represent. The temple is meant to be a trophy. It's meant to be an achievement of our righteousness. It's not meant to be the beginning of it. Can be so difficult. When we talk about the temple being built on the first page in the Ritzeh, in the blessing from the Amidah, when we ask God to accept our prayers and to accept our offerings and all of that, when we finish it, we are saying we want this. Why? So that we can feel God's presence more keenly. We want God to restore his presence to Jerusalem. But that's meant to be the result of our actions, not the foundation in order to inspire us to act.
If the atmosphere is right, then God will come and dwell among us.
If the atmosphere is right, God will come. God is already here, but God will allow the temple to be reestablished one way or another.
The concentrate is present.
And God's presence will be more keenly felt and more easily felt on earth, and particularly in Jerusalem. Absolutely. But, what's that? Oh, okay. Just a sidebar. Gotcha. Let's finish off with our last quote as Rambam tries to...
In this case, even before we finish off,
Yeah.
in this case, I recognize that 3,000 years ago, everybody was doing sacrifices, which is how they worship their various gods. Then God comes along and says, okay, you're not that far advanced, you need sacrifice. No people, but animals. Well, would we not have evolved eventually to a point where watching a goat die is not going to be
Spiritually uplifting?
Yeah. Although the temple might have been...
Maybe. So that is to say, traditional commentary is divided on which sacrifices will be reinstituted or not reinstituted in the temple days. Rambam deals with this extensively and comes down on the side that evolution needed the sacrifices at one point, but is unlikely to need them in the later years. Unlikely though, or that only a few will be reinstituted. My class, I believe it was last year, for Vayikra, was precisely on this point, looking at some of the commentators that say that actually God would have preferred not to give us laws of sacrifices, but only did so because without them, our ancestors would not have understood what was going on. Because, like you say, that was the mode of operation. That's a controversial view, but it does exist within our tradition, and I refer you to my class of last year.
Very
I
nice.
thought also it had something to do with their sacrificing children, we're gonna sasacrifice animals.
Well, they sacrificed everything.
They sacrifice animals too.
I mean, they didn't only sacrifice children, but yes.
That was the limiting.
Well, that was one of the limiting things. I mean, there were a number of things with the sacrificial service that transformed it from being a barbaric practice to being a spiritual one. One of them was, of course, what was being chosen as a sacrifice. Another was the fact that all of the sacrificial services were there either to reestablish my connection to God as a form of atonement or as a thanksgiving to God for some wonderful thing that had happened to me. There are no sacrifices that are bribes to God. That is to say, we don't offer a sacrifice to God before we go on a trip in order that we have a safe trip or a profitable business venture. We don't sacrifice to God in order that I will have a healthy boy. We sacrifice to God after the birth has been born. And that's another way that's trying to clean up what was the general sacrificial style in the nations around. So there are a lot of specific details in the sacrificial services that do avoid many of the spiritual pitfalls that sacrifice can bring. But there are some voices that say, and perhaps we have gone beyond that. Perhaps. And perhaps it's unnecessary, and we are now further to where God would like us to have been, which is to offer the service of our hearts and our lips and of our actions in the general world, rather than the shedding of animal blood. But that is beyond the scope of today's, to finish that discussion.
But there, on the other side of it, there's still a group or groups
Mhm.
that say that there will continue to be sacrifices.
Absolutely. And I'm not trying to speak against that because I'm not so arrogant to believe that I know exactly what will happen in the end of days. There may be sacrifices again, there may not be. There may be a physical temple, there may not be. I can't say that I can interpret all the prophecies perfectly, and I wouldn't. But when we talk about the temple, which does figure prominently in our prayers and in other parts of our tradition, we should understand what it is that we are seeking, what it is that we are yearning for. And if we're only yearning for a magic building, a la what the people in Jeremiah's day thought, we are so far off target that it's not even worth making that part of our discussion. But if we yearn for it as part of the entire fabric of serving God, as a representation of an achievement that we have been able to build a world righteous enough that it's worthy of containing the temple, then looking at it as a symbol in that way, it can be very, very helpful and very inspiring. Let's just finish up with our last text.
Everyone agrees this passage is hard. How can Jeremiah say that God did not command us about burnt offerings or sacrifices? The explanation of this passage is according to what I will now explain. Jeremiah states that the primary purpose of the precepts is what God says. Hearken to my voice that I may be your God and you may be my people. In other words, he is saying, the commandments to bring sacrifices and visit the temple are only for the purpose of leading to that goal. For that goal, I transferred these modes of worship to my name, thus blotting out idolatry and firmly establishing the faith of Israel. You have ignored the goal and taken hold of the means.
All right, that's the sentence I want you to understand. That if you only focus on the means, like they were saying, well, we've got the temple, we're doing the sacrifices, isn't that what we want? Isn't that what God wants? You're missing the fact that these were means to help achieve a goal. that they were not the goal themselves. Now, not to just let us dwell on the errors of Jeremiah's generation, but what about ourselves, right? We are very prone as humans and as Jews to take hold of the means that we have been given to connect to Judaism, to connect to God, and to see them as things that need to be fulfilled in and of themselves. And to do it often in ways that are devoid of the godliness that is meant to be there. So when we put on a talit, are we putting on a talit because it allows us to connect to God in a more powerfully spiritual way? Or are we putting on a talit because that's what you do when you come in the shul? Right? When we come up for an aliyah, do we take it as an honor because we are standing in front of our friends and family and, this is a wonderful, happy occasion, which it hopefully will be? Or do we recognize that we have been chosen to make a blessing over the single most important thing that was ever revealed to humanity, that has given us the instructions to make the world what it should be? And that is the honor, that the community has given us that role for that slice of Torah that day. It's very, very easy to focus on the things and the way we do things and the costumes that we engage in. That is the same problem that bedeviled the people of Jeremiah's generation. They had a huge shining building that attracted a lot of attention, but the underlying psychology is eternal. And we have to be eternally watchful that we don't slip into the same traps, because they are everywhere. We forget why we are doing it. We forget the purpose that we are seeking. We forget the goal that all of these commandments were designed to achieve. They all have their own individual goals, but ultimately they all have the goal that we can be connected to God. And if we treat a commandment merely as a folk way, as a tradition, as something we do in a community, or even just a lovely thing that we find warm and fuzzy when we do it, we're not getting the full value. And ultimately, it will become twisted. And ultimately we'll do it even while denying all the other things that God has asked us to do that maybe don't make us feel warm and fuzzy, but are what the world needs and what we need.
I'd add to that list
Please.
of why we shouldn't do it. A reason that might seem very lofty at the moment. I don't know that I've shared with you my experience with tefillin. I'm going to be 60 years old very soon. So you know that I grew up during the women's movement. And the women's movement affected Judaism at that time in a way that said women should lay tefillin just like men. And so I took on this mitzvah, and every day I went through the ritual. And then about 5 years into it, I woke up one morning and I said, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because this is what women should be doing to prove that women can be as obligated as men in ritual. Whoa, wait a minute. That's not why I should be laying tefillin. And I stopped. And if you pray publicly, people notice that you stopped. And one very wise man, many people came over to me and asked me, and I was reluctant to give them the reasons because I didn't want to discourage anybody from doing this.
Or to impugn that everyone else who did it was only doing it for that reason.
Exactly. So it was awkward. One person came up to me and asked me, and it was a private one-on-one, so I was able to explain this to him. And his response was, well, when you feel that you're doing it for the right reason, will you resume? And I said, yes, I will. So that was a very lofty reason for laying tefillin at that time.
Correct. The only caveat I will add to that, because it's a beautiful story and exactly right, and reminds me very much of a teaching from one of my rabbis in rabbinic school, who said that there was a period of her life where she couldn't stand for the Amidah. And she didn't feel right standing. There was something missing. But she still did the Amidah. So the only caveat I wanted to add was, for mitzvot that are uncontroversibly universal, we don't stop.
Right.
because we're not getting it. We keep doing it, but we also recognize that there's something missing and strive to be able to attain that. So that's the only caveat that I would add to
It's a
that.
good one, it's an important teaching.
So we don't just stop when we don't get it. We aim for it, but we never lose sight of the fact that we're supposed to be getting and we're supposed to be doing it for a better reason or for a fuller reason. Because some of the reasons I mentioned are good reasons. They're just not the only reason we should be hoping that we feel. You know, feeling the acclaim of the community, feeling the pride of being part of a family for having an aliyah. Wonderful feelings to have when you're on the bima. It just shouldn't stop there. There should also be the spiritual connection to what you are doing and what role we play in bringing Torah to the world, and that the aliyah is meant to represent that. Or any activity that we do has that feeling in some way embedded within the action. And we do ourselves a disservice, and we do the world a disservice, and we do God a disservice if we stop short of that. But we still keep trying.
On the other hand,
Mhm.
Of course.
you have to,
You can't work to fill in on both arms.
exactly, you have to recognize human nature.
Of course.
You're not supposed to covet. Coveting is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but everybody covets.
Correct.
You can't stop yourself from coveting, but you can stop yourself from saying, once you're having those feelings, say, you step back and say,
Absolutely.
this is inappropriate and it's wrong.
Correct. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not trying to argue that human nature should be changed, because it's not gonna. But as you say, reflection and the ability to continually guide ourselves to avoid that is absolutely possible, and it is called for. And it's that calling that I'm trying to make sure we understand. That when we want to rebuild the temple, or when we want to describe the temple, that it's not just about a building project. It's about what it's meant to represent. And the temple in particular, if we're not ready to embrace what it represents, we shouldn't put the first stone down.
But if you say human nature is human nature,
Mhm.
we're no better than the Israelites of 5,000 years ago.
Mhm.
Same inclinations,
Yep.
same issues, the same problems. I might argue that the building of that first temple and the building
Mhm.
of the second temple, although
Right.
it had all kinds of problems and we weren't worthy of it, and there were all kinds of issues, there was a lot of good, I would think, that came about because of it.
Right.
And might that also be true of a third temple?
It might.
That might-
It's a good argument. What I would say is that when the third temple comes, if it comes in the way that most of our tradition has said, which is with the coming of Mashiach, we'll have something they didn't in terms of our human nature, which is we'll have the teachings of Mashiach, which will help us understand how we can deal with our human nature better. We already have many of those instructions. It's what we call Torah, which is very much trying to contain our human nature in constructive or at least non-destructive ways, to keep us from violence and from theft and from immorality of all types. Even though our nature may lead us in some of those activities, we already have some fences that help guide us. The temple, I don't know whether or not we can ever handle it without the teachings of Mashiach to help us keep the temple from becoming the world's biggest idol. But I look forward to what Mashiach has to teach us on that. And may it happen soon.
Right.
Take care, everyone.